Welcome to Plain Civics. Thank you for joining us. I'm Joe Ulery.
And I'm Bobbi Fisher.
And our goal is to break down how government works so you can make the government work for you. Episode 24 today, Bobbi. We're going to get to that and wrap up the First Amendment. But before we do, it's time for the Fast Five.
The Fast Five.
And today you're asking me.
I get to ask you. Number one, who was your first celebrity crush?
Well, the first thing I did when I saw that question was blush, because I'm like, oh my gosh, who do I publicly want to say? And then I thought, gosh, I don't even know who to say, because I don't know if I even had a crush. But I'm going with my standard. I think you have a standard go-to of Lucy. You always love Lucy.
I love Lucy, yes.
Well, I love Lucy.
She wasn't necessarily my crush.
No, but she's your definitely favorite go-to.
Right.
And so I'm going to say Melissa McCarthy, because I'm attracted to her for so many reasons, right? Like, she's not a man, obviously, but I'm attracted to her because of her chops, and she's so good at ad-libbing. I think
she really has cute dimples.
Oh my God, yeah. And she just is fun, and I'm attracted to her mood and her attitude.
Number two, who is your favorite comedian?
Melissa McCarthy.
See, I never would have thought you'd answer that for number one, so I would have made a different question.
I made that easy.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Number three, what do you think makes someone a, quote, good person?
I think a good person does the right thing in each situation every time, regardless of how tough that is. I think a good person follows the rules. I think a good person is loyal. I think a good person stands up for others who can't find their voice.
Four, what's your favorite restaurant?
Bruno's Restaurant on East Market Street in Logansport, Indiana.
Pizza, okay.
Gina Dingo, there's a shout out for you.
Number five, if you had to eat the same thing every day for the rest of your life, what would it be?
I think it would be spaghetti and meatballs.
Okay.
How about you? Have you thought about it?
Probably.
Steak and baked potato?
It'd probably be steak, or it would be like fresh shrimp.
Oh, wow.
Like boiled shrimp. I love to get.
You like seafood.
But I want to get it from like Florida or somewhere where they're
fresh.
Actually getting it fresh.
Got it. All right, that's the Fast Five. I hadn't seen those questions until today, though, so that was fun. Thanks, Bobbi. Mm-hmm. And now it's time to get to work today on episode 24.
And now our feature presentation.
So this one is, why is freedom of religion in the First Amendment? We talked about the other parts of the First Amendment, the freedom of expression part, in episodes 21 and 22. Yep. So this covers the rest of the First Amendment, which is actually the first part of the First Amendment, which is the freedom of religion part. So all five of the freedoms that we find in the First Amendment are essential to democratic government. And in this, that's small d democratic.
Yes.
In this episode, we're going to look at the other part. And I wanted to repeat just the first part of the wording of the First Amendment, because religion does come first. So it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And then the rest of the amendment is the freedom of speech, press,
sure.
so on.
Dot.
Right, what we've already talked about.
Right.
So without freedom of religion, members of unpopular faiths could be denied civil freedoms, and this was the way it was done in England and in some of the early American colonies. But over the course of our history, under the current Constitution and Bill of Rights, Congress has sometimes passed laws that affect the rights protected in the Bill of Rights. And that's when the Supreme Court has to usually step in and determine whether a law restricts individual freedom so much that it must be declared unconstitutional. This is the part of the system of checks and balances between the legislative and judicial branches of our government. The fact that freedom of religion is mentioned in the First Amendment indicates its importance to the American people. So let's take a look at religious liberty before 1791, which is when the Bill of Rights was added to our Constitution. We're going to look at religious liberty as it relates to the history of the United States, that is. England, which is where many American colonists or their ancestors came from, had an established church, the Church of England, or officially it's called the Anglican Church. It was officially supported by the government of England. Many colonists, such as the Puritans and the Pilgrims, who I'm sure you learned about in first or second grade when you colored all those little pictures.
The Mayflower.
They left England to escape persecution by the Church of England and the government of England simply because they wanted to practice their faith freely. So what that means is, if you think about, like, no matter whether you're Christian or Jewish or Muslim or whatever, you have certain practices when you attend church services, and they just wanted to be free to change some of those practices or do things a little differently, I guess is the easiest way to say it. But they were bound by the guidelines set up by the Church of England. So once they settled in America, they quickly established churches of their own, which they could then run the way they wanted. In much of colonial America, church and state were not separate, just as it had been in England. So colonists had to support churches that were there through taxation, regardless of their beliefs. So even later on, for example, in Massachusetts colony, which is where both the Pilgrims and the Puritans settled, if you weren't a part of those religions, if you managed to stay in that colony anyway, you still had to pay taxes that went toward supporting them. So that part didn't really change any. It may have just been the way the church was run and the way the services were conducted that might have been different than they were in England. Also, in some colonies, citizens were not allowed to vote unless they belonged to the church. Colonists were also required to attend church on Sunday and could be punished by whipping, for example.
Oh my gosh.
If they failed an examination of faith.
Man.
So, well, I'm going to tell you, I used to show, it was a Disney movie called Johnny Tremaine. Mm-hmm. And of course, it was very much against the law. And by that, I mean the religious law to do any work at all on a Sunday.
Mm-hmm, the Sabbath.
So I had to explain that when I would show that video, because they sneak around. Johnny is doing like a internship as a silversmith. He accidentally ruins a piece that is the head of the colony wants. And so they sneak around, and they actually have to have people posted at the windows, because there were actually policeman type people that went around during the day and night on a Sunday to make sure people weren't working in their businesses, because you could be punished.
Goodness.
Yeah. So anyway, side note there, just to kind of help you understand what it was like.
That's serious crap, though.
So under established religion, a sin became a crime, basically. Mm-hmm. In New England, or the northeastern colonies, the congregational religion was the established church. In the southern colonies, the Church of England, which became known as the Episcopal Church after the Revolutionary War, was the established religion. Only 4 colonies, Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island, did not have established churches. Maryland tolerated other religions, even though the colony had been established as a Catholic colony. In its Toleration Act of 1649, it protected the rights of all persons, quote, professing to believe in Jesus Christ, end quote. So in Maryland, in other words, they supported the Catholic Church, but you could live there if you weren't Catholic, and they would tolerate you.
Tolerate you.
So now keep in mind, toleration was not the same as religious freedom. Toleration just meant that religious beliefs were not a right, but a privilege. So you were privileged to not hold the Catholic beliefs, I guess.
Goodness. Yeah.
You were going to be subject to the toleration of others if you weren't Catholic. One great colonial advocate of religious freedom was Roger Williams, a Puritan minister who was expelled from Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1635 because he claimed the government had no right to enforce religious laws, which was highly controversial at the time. He founded the colony of Rhode Island in 1636 and guaranteed religious liberty for all denominations. By the time of the Revolutionary War, the idea of religious freedom was growing in the colonies. Virginia, for example, moderated some of its earlier punishments against religious dissenters, but still jailed citizens who denied the doctrine of the divinity of the Bible. In other words, their belief in Christianity. Thomas Jefferson spoke out against such practices, stating that the government should only punish actions that harm other people, but should not punish beliefs. Jefferson said, quote, "It does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God," End of quote. He helped lead the fight in Virginia for religious freedom. The Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776 included a provision for religious freedom, but many prominent Virginians, such as George Washington and Patrick Henry, advocated a tax to support all Christian churches in the state. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison opposed the church tax. Jefferson wrote the Statute of Religious Liberty to guarantee freedom of religion in Virginia. Madison wrote an essay called, and this is its title, Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessment. That's the end of the title. Remonstrance literally means to protest, object to, or disapprove. So that essay helped convince the Virginia legislature to pass Jefferson's statute in 1786. It provided the most extensive protections of religious freedom of its time. The law stated that, quote, whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free, no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship. End of quote. In addition, the law said, quote, all men shall be free to profess their opinion in the matters of religion, and that the same in no wise affect their civil capacities. End of quote. Kind of sounds like the First Amendment and Article 6 of our Constitution. So Virginians could no longer be denied the right to vote and participate in government because of their religious beliefs. Jefferson was so proud of this law that he had his authorship of it, along with his authorship of the Declaration of Independence, listed on his tombstone.
So cool.
By the time the U.S. Constitution was written in 1787, religious freedom had become important on a national level. In fact, it is one of the few individual liberties included in the text of the Constitution in 1787. As I hinted just a minute ago, Article 6 of the Constitution states that, quote, no religious tests shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States, end quote. So that's actually in our Constitution. This means that government jobs could not and cannot be limited to certain religious groups. This short clause in Article 6 was not enough to convince leaders at the time, that is, at the time of the Constitution's writing, that it provided enough protection of religious freedom. Several states agreed that there needed to be more protection added in the Bill of Rights. So James Madison did just that by creating the Establishment and Free Exercise clauses in the First Amendment. As I just said, freedom of religion in the First Amendment consists of two parts: the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. The Establishment Clause forbids the government from creating or establishing an official church, formally supporting religious activities or giving preference to religion. The Free Exercise Clause prohibits the government from interfering with the expression of religious beliefs. Sometimes these two religion clauses come into conflict with each other, as I will point out in just a short time. So we're going to look at the Establishment Clause first. This restricts the relationship between the government and the church. It forbids the government from creating or establishing an official church, nor can it support one religion over another or religion over non-religion. You know, we don't have like the Anglican or Church of England.
Right.
And I think of this when people are arguing, you know, that, well, we're a Christian nation. Well, but we aren't.
Right.
I mean, and it, you know, this pretty much explains that.
Yeah, right.
And the fact even I would go back further and say, because many of our framers, some were devout Christians, but
some weren't at all.
Some were deists and just thought, yes, there's a higher being, but they didn't prescribe to any particular religion. Probably the most famous phrase related to the Establishment Clause comes from a letter that was from Thomas Jefferson sent to the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut, which was written and sent in October 1801. So this is 10 years after the Bill of Rights was ratified that Jefferson sent this letter, where Jefferson says that the Establishment Clause erects, quote, a wall of separation between church and state, end of quote.
And that saying has lasted for 225
we hear it
years.
all the time, right. Therefore, the Establishment Clause is often said to require separation of church and state, even though those words do not actually appear in the First Amendment. Sometimes, like the court, that's how they establish some of their rulings, is they have to look at what, like the framers had written in their own writings, or, you know, they look back at the arguments of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. I mean, that's all they can go on.
Yeah.
Is how did they think about this? What did they write about? What did they talk about?
A lot of times we think, oh, it's just 9 judges up there sitting there and they decide using their opinion. And that's not how it works.
No, and when you hear them talking about, well, those members of the Supreme Court are textualists, or they think of strict construction of there are different things. And I think I talk about those in here
A little bit later.
Yeah. So the Supreme Court did not rule on the actual meaning of the Establishment Clause until, get this, 1947 in the case Everson versus the Board of Education, which incorporated the clause to apply to the states, and the court defined the clause as follows. Neither a state nor the federal government can set up a church. Neither can pass laws which aid one religion, aid all religions, or prefer one religion over another. Neither can force a person to go to or to remain away from church against his will, or force him to profess a belief or disbelief in any religion. So that's an actual quote from the court's decision. The court also said the government may not participate in religious affairs nor impose taxes for their support. So you might be thinking, why do most public officials take their oath of office in the name of God with their hand on the Bible? And why do sessions of Congress, state legislatures, and maybe city councils open or close with a prayer? Mm-hmm. Shouldn't these practices be prohibited by the Establishment Clause? Some people say yes, arguing that the Constitution requires a strict separation between church and state. They oppose any mingling of the two. Others, known as accommodationists, believe that the government must at times accommodate or make allowances for the role of religion in society. The accommodationist interpretation of the U.S. Constitution is a view that the government can and should cooperate with religion, provided it does not favor one religion over another. This interpretation holds that the framers intended for the government to support religious practices, not to be hostile or neutral towards them, and that accommodations are necessary to protect religious freedom in a pluralistic society. And by pluralistic, we mean that we have many distinct cultural, ethnic, and religious groups that coexist. So I guess the best way I can explain that is, let's say you have somebody going into Congress that's not of the Christian faith. They can substitute and have their Koran or whatever, or maybe they're not religious at all. I mean,
don't use a Bible at all.
Right. That could be, or like you have a city council, or a state government, and maybe a lot of them are Christian, but you have somebody that protests and says, well, but I'm Muslim. They could ask that there be a separate prayer or whatever,
Sure.
To accommodate. So that's what they're saying here, is that, it doesn't have to just be one.
Right.
But we also have to keep in mind that if we look at religion, a majority of Americans are Christian.
Sure.
But not everybody. So you have to accommodate those differences. Okay, otherwise, the belief is that government could be seen as being hostile to religion and risk violating the Free Exercise Clause. So that's kind of what I was just explaining. At times, the Supreme Court has leaned both ways. Hopefully, listeners will understand the difficult job the court really has in interpreting the Constitution in these cases. Supreme Court justices struggle with balancing their personal and political ideologies against the need to follow legal precedent and constitutional mandates. This tension is further complicated by pressures from public opinion, political influences, and the potential for result-oriented decisions that may undermine the court's legitimacy. Most cases involving the Establishment Clause involve religion and education. Since public schools are funded and regulated by the government, they are considered agencies of the government. So any religious programs in them raise Establishment Clause issues, as does government aid to private religious schools, which is something we see more and more of happening in about the last 10, 15 years.
Also known as sometimes charter schools.
Right. Landmark and foundational cases involving the Establishment Clause are Everson versus the Board of Education from 1947, which I talked about just a couple minutes ago, which established that the Establishment Clause applies to states and can be used to argue for the wall of separation between church and state. It actually involved a New Jersey law that allowed public funds to be used for busing students to religious schools, but established the concept that the government cannot be an instrument for the promotion of religion. In another landmark case, Engel versus Vitale from 1962, the court ruled that mandatory school-sponsored prayer in public schools violates the First Amendment, even if participation is voluntary. In Abington School District versus Shemp from 1963, the court extended the ruling of Engel versus Vitale, holding that mandatory Bible reading in public schools was also unconstitutional. These two cases are still considered foundational in regard to separation of church and state in public schools. With the case Lemon versus Kurtzman from 1971, the court established a three-part test based on its holdings in previous cases for determining whether a government policy violates the Establishment Clause. The Lemon test, which is what it became known as, says, number one, they have to look at the policy's purpose must be secular, not religious. Two, the policy's primary effect must neither advance nor inhibit religion. And three, the policy must avoid as excessive entanglement of government and religion. This, like I said, became known as the Lemon test. Was
different from the Lemon Law.
Right, not the same. Was one of several the court used to evaluate government policies under the Establishment Clause. Later in the 1990s, some members of the Supreme Court started opposing the Lemon test, but did not completely overturn it. The court lessened the importance of excessive entanglement in the case Agostini versus Felton in 1997, and in 2022, the court completely abandoned the Lemon test. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Some other landmark cases involving the Establishment Clause include Marsh versus Chambers from 1983, which upheld legislative prayer, which had a long-standing history as distinct from public school prayer. Wallace versus Jaffrey from 1985 struck down an Alabama law authorizing a 1-minute moment of silence for, quote, meditation or voluntary prayer, end quote, as it endorsed religion. Lee versus Weissman from 1992 ruled that clergy-led prayer at public school graduation ceremonies is unconstitutional. Santa Fe Independent School District versus Doe from 2000 banned student-led prayer at public high school football games. The Lemon test, which I mentioned a minute ago, was effectively replaced in 2022, so not that long ago.
Really?
In the case Kennedy versus Bremerton School District. In this decision, the court stated it would now use a test based on, quote, historical practices and traditions, end quote, to interpret the Establishment Clause, and would shift away from the Lemon test's abstract principles. This new approach looks at historical practices and understandings to evaluate government actions related to religion. Other more recent cases show the court moving further away from the earlier strict interpretations of the Establishment Clause. And I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's different interpretations, so I'll kind of sidestep here. We have what's called strict interpretation and loose interpretation. Strict interpretation means they're reading the Constitution literally, with the government only having powers explicitly listed in the Constitution. If they are talking about a loose interpretation, people that have that kind of interpretation, they're allowing for broader applications, including implied powers and adaptability to modern needs. So they might look at societal, like that's more accepted today than like gay marriage, for example.
Sure.
Or mixed marriage.
Sure.
40, 50 years ago, if you were a mixed couple.
Right.
Lots of discrimination, and so if you had a case come to you for that, person with a loose interpretation might have ruled whatever the societal standards were at the time.
Where today it's less likely.
Would be, less likely to happen. So that's just kind of what that means. Strict interpretation, or strict construction as it's sometimes called, aligns kind of with the idea of limited government and original intent, which is another term you'll often hear batted around if they're talking about the Supreme Court or a federal court. While loose construction views the Constitution more as a living document, which the strict view emphasizes states' rights, while the loose view supports a stronger federal government, and again, more looking at what's acceptable in today's society. Yeah. In Carson versus Macon in 2022, the court held that Maine's tuition assistance program could not exclude students attending religious schools. The court found that the program violated the free exercise clause because it discriminated against students based on the religious nature of their schools, which was protected under the First Amendment. Some other landmark Supreme Court cases not involving schools include American Legion versus American Humanist Association. This is from 2019, in which the court allowed a cross in a public park to remain, ruling that the Establishment Clause must be interpreted by, quote, historical practices and understandings, and not solely through a strict separationist framework. So basically they're saying that that's not hurting anybody.
Right.
In Lynch versus Donnelly, we're kind of going backwards a little bit here, from 1984, the court upheld a city's display of a nativity scene in a shopping district.
I remember that one.
Yeah, suggesting that some government displays with religious symbols are permissible if they have a secular purpose. So I guess they're saying the nativity is just a Christmas decoration?
Sure. Yeah, that one's kind of gone back and forth over the years.
Right. In the case Town of Greece versus Galloway from 2014, the court held that legislative prayer was permissible even if it was Christian-dominated, provided the town was open to prayers of all faiths. So kind of like I explained a few minutes ago. So if I'm a Muslim or, another religion, if I want my prayer said, then they have to give me that opportunity.
Accommodation, yeah.
Right. Finally, in Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue from 2020, the court ruled that a state could not exclude religious schools from a program that provided scholarships to private schools using tax credits. As you can see, the meaning of the Establishment Clause is often hotly contested, and establishment cases in the Supreme Court, if you look at them, a lot of times they lead to 5-4 splits. Okay, before we move on to the Free Exercise Clause part of the First Amendment, I'm going to mention a couple of other cases that determined whether government action was benefiting religion. Such government action would violate the Establishment Clause only if its purpose and effect are to sponsor or advance a religion. Some states initially had what were known as, quote, blue laws, which required businesses to close on Sunday and to aid religions that honored Sunday as their Sabbath. This custom dates back to colonial times in America, like I was telling about Johnny Tremaine, when a majority of colonists were of a Christian faith, and Sunday is the day of rest and worship, and if you were working on Sunday, you could be punished.
Well, you think about like car dealerships closed on Sunday.
Right.
Bars used to be closed on Sunday. Some of these things have changed over the years, but some remain.
Right. In this case, in Maryland had a blue law, and it was challenged when a large discount store was cited for being open on Sundays. So this case is known as McGowan versus Maryland, and it's from 1961. The court ruled that Sunday closing laws serve the secular purpose of creating a uniform day of rest and relaxation. Another case, Walls versus Tax Commission from 1970, challenged the tax-exempt status of religious property by the state and federal government. The court upheld this practice, noting that tax exemptions were also provided for other educational and charitable organizations, and such exemptions indicate government's, quote, benevolent neutrality toward religion, not its official support. So I guess what they're saying is, no matter what religion the church represents, they're all tax exempt. So we're not favoring like just Christian churches or, they're all tax exempt. So this was the first case to articulate the excessive entanglement doctrine that 1 year later became the third prong of the Lemon test, which we don't even use anymore. But that just, even though they don't use it, this kind of shows how they eventually will come up with some of these cases they use as guidance for later cases. While cases under the Establishment Clause involve government policies that aid religion, cases under the Free Exercise Clause challenge government policies that burden religion. Most laws challenged under the Free Exercise Clause today do not discriminate against a particular religion directly, but rather impose a hardship when applied to certain religious groups. Freedom of belief is one of the very few absolute rights in the Bill of Rights. Remember, we talked about those back when we did the episode on the Bill of Rights. Like we talked about, like freedom of speech is not absolute. There are some cases where it can be limited. But in this case, freedom of belief is not something that has any limitations on it. But religious belief, here's where the problem lies. Religious belief often involves action which the government can regulate. The Free Exercise Clause is often discussed alongside the Establishment Clause, which prohibits the government from establishing a religion. These two clauses work together to ensure religious freedom. The clause safeguards the right to hold religious beliefs as well as to live out those beliefs through actions with certain limitations. The government cannot make laws that penalize or discriminate against individuals or groups based on their religious views, but the government can sometimes restrict religious practices if there is a compelling interest such as public safety, which is at stake. From the beginning, courts in the United States have struggled to find a balance between the religious liberty of believers, who often claim the right to be excused or exempted from laws that interfere with their religious practices, and the interests of society reflected in those very laws. Early state court decisions went both ways on this central question. Now, hopefully, as I discuss these cases, you'll understand where this becomes very difficult for the court. The first Supreme Court case involving the Free Exercise Clause was Reynolds versus the United States from 1878. It distinguished between belief and action. What followed was perhaps the most extreme government assault on religious freedom in American history. Reynolds was a Mormon, or from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who lived in Utah, and he had more than one wife, a practice called polygamy, which was advocated by the Mormon Church. Reynolds and hundreds of church leaders were arrested and jailed. Rank-and-file Mormons were deprived of their right to vote, and Congress dissolved the LDS Church, or the Mormon Church, and expropriated most of its property until the church finally agreed to abandon the practice of polygamy. The court upheld Reynolds' conviction under federal law despite his religious beliefs. The court expressed its view that civil society may legitimately regulate marriage, which it argued was the foundation of social relations. The Free Exercise Clause, the court said, did not protect actions that were violations of social duties or subversive of good order. The court noted that, for example, religious beliefs in human sacrifice would not exempt a person from being prosecuted for murder. The court later upheld laws that required school children to be vaccinated despite their parents' religious beliefs, prohibited the use of poisonous snakes in religious ceremonies, and parents who denied their children medical treatment could be prosecuted. So, back in the late 1800s, marriage was looked at more, strictly than what society does today. Right. Now, would this case have been seen the same way in 2025?
We don't know.
Who knows?
Yeah.
But here we see the court using societal norms to guide their ruling in this case. The case Cantwell versus Connecticut from 1940 incorporated the Free Exercise Clause to apply to the states, and the court again distinguished between belief and action, stating that free exercise of religion, quote, embraces two concepts, freedom to believe and freedom to act. The first is absolute, but in the nature of things, the second cannot be. That's the end of that. In this case, the court struck down a state law requiring solicitors of religious groups to be licensed. Cantwell was a Jehovah's Witness who was arrested for soliciting donations without a required permit. That was the action. This case would be followed by several other free exercise cases, also often involving Jehovah's Witnesses. One of the most controversial was Minersville School District versus Gobitis, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, from 1940, where the two Gobitis children were suspended from school because they refused to salute the U.S. flag, which was required by many states at the time. The Gobitis family believed that this practice was idolatry, which violated the Ten Commandments. The court heard this case while the U.S. was in the midst of fighting World War II. The court upheld the flag salute law and said that, quote, religious liberty must give way to political authority, end quote. Public outcry over this decision caused it to be overturned just 3 years later in the case West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, 1943. This case also involved Jehovah's Witness children, but the court struck down flag salute laws on both free exercise and free speech grounds. The court ruled that forcing students to salute the flag and recite the Pledge of Allegiance was contrary to the Bill of Rights. In this landmark decision, Justice Robert H. Jackson said, quote, to believe that patriotism will not flourish if patriotic ceremonies are voluntary and spontaneous instead of a compulsory routine is to make an unflattering estimate of the appeal of our institutions to free minds, end quote. It's important to note that the court set forth the following test to decide if a religious practice is protected under the Free Exercise Clause. First, the court determines whether the beliefs are, quote, sincerely held, end quote. To do so, however, the court cannot consider whether or not the beliefs are factually true. In United States versus Ballard from 1944, the court held that, quote, men may believe what they cannot prove, end quote. If the religious beliefs are sincere, the court has to balance the burden of the individual's religious practice against the government's interest in the challenged action. Traditionally, the government could win only if its interest was, quote, compelling, a very strict test. A compelling interest is an extremely important and necessary reason used by the Supreme Court to evaluate government actions that infringe on a person's fundamental rights. It is a standard of strict scrutiny, meaning the government must prove its action is essential to achieve this interest and is the, quote, least restrictive means, end quote, to do so. Examples of compelling interests include national security, public safety, and public health. Also, for the Free Exercise Clause to apply at all, individuals must first prove that the government forces them to violate their religious beliefs. In the mid-20th century, the Supreme Court developed a, quote, strict scrutiny standard requiring the government to show a, quote, compelling interest for restricting religious practice. We see this in the cases Sherbert versus Verner in 1963 and Wisconsin v. Yoder in 1972. In both of these landmark cases, the court struck down government actions using the compelling interest test because they said the Free Exercise Clause was violated. The Sherbert case involved Adele Sherbert, who was denied unemployment benefits by South Carolina because she refused to work on Saturdays, which was something forbidden by her Seventh-day Adventist faith. In Wisconsin v. Yoder in 1972, the state's compulsory attendance law came up against the Amish practice of only sending their children to school through 8th grade. They then separate themselves from the modern world to learn the Amish agrarian lifestyle or farming lifestyle, which is essential to their religious faith. The court ruled that a law that, quote, unduly burdens the practice of religion, end quote, without a compelling interest, even though it might be neutral on its face, would be unconstitutional. The standard shifted again in 1990 with the Employment Division of Oregon versus Smith decision, which held that the clause does not exempt individuals from generally applicable laws that have a secular purpose. In this case, the court upheld an Oregon law prohibiting the use of peyote, which is a hallucinogenic drug that some Native Americans use in their religious ceremonies. It comes from a plant. This decision held that the state could deny unemployment benefits to a person fired for violating a state prohibition on the use of peyote, even though the use of the drug was part of a religious ritual. Although states have the power to accommodate otherwise illegal acts performed in pursuit of religious beliefs, they are not required to do so. So you can see this, the court has a difficult time balancing all of these different things. So when you look at court cases, hopefully you'll look at it with a different...
Looking at these dates in the parentheses afterwards and just wondering how some of these cases would test today with the makeup of the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
We talk about established case law and stuff, which has shifted as well in recent times.
I'm glad you brought that up because I did look up to make sure that none of these had more recent cases that had changed the outcomes. Yeah. But I thought this one was interesting where just because they're Native American uses, but the state considers it illegal.
It reminds me of the church of the marijuana or whatever that was in Indianapolis.
Right.
And they were like, no, marijuana is built into our faith.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the court has a difficult job for sure.
Yeah.
If you listen to our last two episodes, 21 and 22, where we covered freedom of expression, which is speech, press, assembly, and petition, and now this episode on the two parts of freedom of religion, the establishment and free exercise clauses, two things should be clear. One is that we don't always know what the exact meaning of the words written in the First Amendment, or the Constitution for that matter, mean, and we can only determine what we think they mean by reading and studying other writings from the time, especially writings of the framers or the men that set all these words down to lead us, and trying to interpret those writings balanced with events of the time. And two, as times change, often so do societal values, which may also change the way these words are interpreted. To make decisions, the people who interpret the documents written over 200 years ago have to take into account what they think the original meaning was and how society and societal norms differ from then to now. And before I go on, coupled with that, when justices are put on the courts, the Supreme Court in particular, they have their own specific view as to whether they're a strict constructionist or a loose. So those often come into conflict as well, because if you've got 6 judges or justices who are strict and think they can only interpret it the way it would have been interpreted, they're going to come into conflict with the other 3 that may have a loose interpretation and think that they can look at the way things are now when they make decisions.
Yeah, and I can see both sides of that too, because when you look at the original language and you talk about a right to bear arms, we didn't have guns that could mow down hundreds of people with the squeeze of a trigger. So I see both sides of how you have to take today's modernization. And there's a lot of, I wouldn't want to be on that court, but there's a lot of different factors that go into these. And that's why a lot of times things change and these are challenged. And it's...
and like back to the other example, the mixed marriage or the gay marriage, it's like they don't really have a guidebook to go by.
Right.
So, you can hold it against them, whether if they're a strict constructionist or loose, if you're thinking that, but there's no rule book that tells them how they should interpret it. So,
and a lot of times justices will say they don't like to get ahead out on their skis ahead of popular opinion in the day, but I would argue in some cases they went ahead and took the leap of faith and people came around. I think gay marriage is one of those. I was surprised as a gay man that, in the 2000s when they went ahead and said, nope, you can do it. And there was some back and forth there as it went, back and forth between the courts. And then it was just again back in front of the Supreme Court last week. But I think that, a lot of times they don't want to get out ahead of public opinion. So they do take some of that into consideration as well.
And like you were saying a few minutes ago, you wonder how some of these cases might be heard today. Like, it's not unheard of for the court to overturn like a big previous case of 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, which upheld the right to separate but equal in the South in particular, where blacks had to use a separate water fountain, separate, that one happened to be a train car. And then in 1954, we've got a totally different court makeup, and they overturn Plessy with the Brown versus Board of Education, where they say, no, separate but equal is not right. You throw that out. You can't have separate.
Equal can't mean two different things.
Right. If people bring cases, it's not unheard of for them to change. Well, we say that with the abortion law too.
Yeah, and the one thing I'm wondering that I want to research we took a deep dive on this, is the Supreme Court deciding to turn away Kim Davis and her challenge to same-sex marriage. They batted that down and said, we're not taking it, and I need to look, because you've got me thinking now of how many people on the court does it take? If one person says, yeah, I want to hear it, then do the other 8 just go along and they have to hear that case? Or does it take 2 justices to say, yeah, we want to hear that case? Or is it 3?
Now, I don't know the exact answer to that. I do know that when they all meet.
Yes.
But I don't know if it takes, I can't answer, because they meet in private. There's not even any.
Right.
There's just the 9 justices.
Yep. And there's not always a record of it. Sometimes, like with that decision, it came out without explanation.
Right.
There was nothing that said there were a couple dissenters or who wanted to take this up. So
Right.
that could be a whole other topic sometime.
You'll have to let me know what you
I
think.
will.
We looked at a lot of Supreme Court cases in the 3 episodes about the First Amendment, and I apologize for that, but I will say there's always been constitutional scholars, lawmakers, and judges who have maintained either the loose construction interpretation or the strict interpretation of the meaning of the words of the Constitution. Sometimes these views can conflict on even the same court, and they're, going to play a part in the decisions made by the court. So this is, in my view, just another reason why our Constitution and its amendments are considered a living document, because they can be challenged and possibly changed.
Yeah, look at Roe v. Wade. We thought that was completely settled law, did we not?
Right.
1973?
Well, I'm sure in 1896 people thought Plessy versus Ferguson was... Yeah, so...
So, yeah, I would agree with you that it's
one thing I can say is
evolving.
We may not be alive if it changes.
Right. We might not be here to report on it.
So our next episode, which will be towards the end of December, will be a special episode to take us into the new year, so stay tuned.
That will be 25 episodes, right?
It will.
25. I'm proud of, this would be a good chance for me to just say I'm proud to announce that our listenership got an award this week on the platform we distribute, Buzzsprout. We had over 2,500 people who have listened up to that point to the 22 episodes that we had published, which is something I'm very, very proud of. A lot of people anybody can launch a podcast. Anybody. All you need is a microphone and a recorder.
And there are a lot of them out there.
Right? But a lot of them fail after 3 episodes, 4 episodes, certainly by 10. Thank you so much to the people who listen to this. Thank you so much to the people that talk about it to others. This has been a big year for us. We've got a couple more coming your way, but we are going to be making some changes, a few little tweaks here and there cosmetically. But Bobbi, this has been fun.
The only thing I would say is I wish we could get more input from our listeners.
We would love to hear more from
as
people.
To, did you like it? Did you, do you learn anything? Were we awful?
Yeah.
Whether it's good or bad, it would be nice to have some more ratings or
feedback.
comments on either the platform. I know on Apple you can leave comments or ratings, or on our Facebook page for Plain Civics would be great.
Nothing would make us happier
I see people click and like or share stuff, but then we've only had maybe 2 people leave actual comments.
I don't think we've really pissed anybody off, though.
I hope not.
I don't think they've not told us if we have.
I hope not.
And it's time now for the pop quiz. Bueller.
The last episode, our question was, we elect a president for how many years, or what is their term of office? And if you answered 4 years, you are correct.
Oh,
and they can't serve more than 2 terms, so no more than 8 years. This episode's question from the U.S. Naturalization Test is, if the president can no longer serve, who becomes the president?
Yep. And then there's a whole great big long list.
There is. There is a whole line of succession in case...
I don't want to give too much away, though.
Right. Because who knows? Although there is a reason that the president and vice president do not fly anywhere together. They have separate planes.
It's like the people that held the KFC recipe and the Coke recipe can't fly together. Don't put all your power in one place. All right, fun. So that brings us now to the Plain Civics Honor Roll. Bobbi?
And I have been contacted a couple times on private message by another former student of mine, Zach Hoover, who listens to our podcast and he said he enjoys it. And
that's awesome.
He's even private messaged me a week or so ago. He had some further questions about a couple of things. And so
you even challenged to ask if he was any relation to President Hoover. So that's some homework for Zach.
Right.
Yeah, that's extra credit for Zach.
Zach, you need to do your genealogy project.
Yeah, congratulations, Zach Hoover. And what's really cool is that Zach was, like I am, a student of history and a student of Bobby Fischer. So Thanks for all your work on this episode
welcome.
and this year, Bobbi. You've put a lot of essays into this, a lot of research, and I certainly want you to know I, for one, really appreciate it. Yep. That's it for this episode of Plain Civics, breaking down the basics. No politics, just facts. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay informed and stay engaged. This is Plain Civics. Join us for the journey as we break down the basics of how government works so you can make the government work for you.